An example being, for example, pop-in beer boxes. If you send an entire bale of pop-in beer boxes to a market, they can turn it into new paper. If you send pop-in beer boxes mixed in with a whole bunch of other papers because you don't take the time to make that next separation, the pop-in beer boxes go on a really, really long ride using a lot of fuel, using a lot of energy, and in the end just get skimmed off and put in somebody else's dumpster. It wasn't the resident's dumpster, it wasn't the city's dumpster, it wasn't the hauler's dumpster, it becomes the end market's dumpster. All along the path, there are ways for the material to become recycled or not. All along the path, there are choices that this RFP lays out, that this process lays out, that this program lays out. And all along the path, you can do things to affect that in a positive or negative way. Each of them involves money, each of them involves time, but all of them involve an environmental benefit that comes when you take a product and make it into a new product. The real savings there is because the energy that you took to make a new glass bottle out of glass that was recycled is far less than the energy that's required to make a glass bottle or any other product out of virgin material. That's where the environmental benefit is, because that's where the energy savings is. And so if you not only don't make that savings, but you spend a lot more energy and a lot more time and a lot more money getting to that place where it goes off the path, you're kind of defeating the whole purpose. And that's what our system is about, and that's what our philosophy of zero waste is about. So I'm sure that might be 2 minutes because you're giving me the eye. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Mr. Nephew, you want to take a crack?
Well, I'd just like to repeat, I think I don't need to ask the other ones, but tell me what your residual rate is.
Our facility's residual rate, which means the residual rate of all of the material coming into our facility, is less than 2%. It varies year by year, but it's less than 2%. If you look at just an individual city like Maplewood, it can go even lower than that because we take material from third-party haulers, from companies that don't collect for us but collect for themselves, and then there are a very small number of MRFs they can bring that material to. And we're one of them, particularly if you do dual stream. So our facility, including all that material, it's less than 2%. But as the information in the council packet says, for the city of Maplewood, it's far less than that, and often less than 1%.
Lannis.
My question was, are you capable of doing the contract, but you have the contract, so you're ready to go, just extending that?
Yes.
But may I ask you a separate question?
Yeah.
Do you know what the participation level is right now for Maplewood residents?
It varies year by year. We do a participation study every year where we count the number of participants and the number of set-outs being how many people any given week do in participation, meaning overall in the city, how many people participate in the program. It's around 70 to 72%. It varies year to year, but that's where it's been pretty solidly.
You're telling me 72% of Maplewood residents participate in recycling, and you use a criteria that is set out and volume, did you say?
No, it's a recycling kind of deal. So when you do a participation study, you don't just want to count 1 week because someone's on vacation or they didn't have enough stuff this week, so they don't set out 1 week, but they still recycle occasionally. So what we do is over the course of a month, we count the routes over and over and over again, week after week after week after week. So you end up with a set-out rate, meaning any given week, X% of people participate. But if you look at overall, whoever at any point participates, the participation rate is usually higher. So for example, if you're on vacation 1 week, you weren't counted as a set-out the first week, but the next week you were. We wouldn't consider you a non-participant because there was a week in our study that you didn't participate. It means that if at any point you set out your red bins with material in them, you're considered a participant.
Okay, so that's I wanted to make sure I understood that. Because 72% is incredibly high. That's incredibly something to be proud of as a city.
Very.
That is if you use it just as that number, you're saying out of all the residents, at some point, they have recycled.
Correct.
But on a weekly basis, that number is not 70%.
No, it's not significantly lower, but it's around 60.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, 60 to 64.
That's good.
And what we found in cities that start doing a single stream program, if you've had a really low participation rate program, you can get a bump because people never participated to begin with. But in cities around the state where you've had a high participation rate and you switch to a single stream system, you don't really get that bump. The bump comes when you have a pretty abysmal program and then you make this change, you see an improvement. But when you have a good program and you make the change.
Mr. Nephew.
I have a follow-up question to that. When you're talking about that, you're speaking in terms of the participation rate. What's the effect on volume?
That's a pretty complicated question. Volume is dependent on composition. It's also dependent on what materials are in your program that can be collected. You can have a really high amount of tonnage and a really high amount of residual, and it's going to, wow, we're collecting a lot of stuff, ... What then?
Right.
So if you're using as a metric, how much stuff can we get people to put out? It really incentivizes you to say, don't tell them to not put out anything. Tell them to put out anything. Tell them to put out cars. We don't care, because it gets our tonnage way up, and then that becomes the metric that we're used to be measured against. So for us, it's a matter of participation and tonnage and residual rate and lots of other anecdotal things like participation in events, what people say when they call us, customer service type stuff.
Well, and obviously what the question playing skeptic here against you is that perhaps we can't increase the participation a whole lot or are not likely to, but if the same people find that they can put more recycling out, even if there's a higher residual rate, if we have 20% more volume and now 5% instead of 1% is lost, we might still be having a significantly big bump of percentage of recyclable materials being recycled. If
you're speaking of tonnage, yes.
Yes.
And again, thinking about all those different places along the path where the material that could have been recycled then isn't.
Right.
I think it's important in that metric to be able to say that what we care about is tons. What we care about is tons, tons, tons. To be able to then hold accountable a hauler, anybody who you're working with, to say that, okay, at all those different points where things could go off the track, how can we hold them accountable at all those points? Because if you said, okay, well, I'm going to hold you accountable if your residual rate at your facility is above X, that incentivizes me to find some other way for that material to not get counted as residual, meaning if I can bail it up and send it to a paper mill, or if I can bail it up and send it somewhere else, then I'm off the hook, and my tonnage is really high. And so what we are in favor of is actually doing things like bail audits and stuff like that as a city, where at random intervals or however it's agreed upon in a contract, you can go to the city, you can go to the hauler, you can go to your partner and say, we're going to come in, we're going to pick some bales out in your facility, and we're going to break them open. And if we find that there's stuff in there that is not recyclable, or that even if it is recyclable because of the way that it's baled, again, back to the pop and beer boxes, it will never become a new product. You don't get to count that as shipped material. And so in terms of making sure that your program works, regardless of cost, regardless of anything else, those are the kind of accountability factors that I think make sense, if your goal is to make sure that you're maximizing the environmental benefit, regardless of your collection method and regardless of any of that other stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There was a multifamily question. Do I get to answer one?
I think you've had your time. You've done a good job with it, too.
I think Kathy already explained how you're working with multifamily facilities.
There's an issue with carts that I wanted to bring up.
No.
Okay.
Is there another person out there, another company? Is that everybody? 30 seconds about carts.
Okay. The current multifamily program, Eureka Recycling owns the carts, which means if you switch to another company, that whether they're going to do dual stream or single stream, a potential cost that hasn't been accounted for in the RFP is that those carts go away and now someone has to buy new carts. And so I think it's worth looking at whether or not any of the other proposals has planned to buy carts, or whether that by default means that the city now has to purchase recycling carts for every multifamily building in the city. It wasn't included as something in the RFP, so I'm sure it wasn't addressed.
Valid point.
Thank you for giving me the chance.
Mr. Nephew.
Process question. The vote this evening is going to be to proceed with negotiations with one of these three recommended haulers. And then or a ranking amongst them. What is the process of those negotiations? At what point does it come back as an agreement for ratification or evaluation? For example, if there's an issue about multifamily carts, which has some effect on the cost, and it throws a monkey wrench into negotiations with some person, does that come back to us, or how would that work?
Mayor, Council, as Sean pointed out in her presentation, staff wants to kick this item back to Council at the last meeting in October, and we'd like to have a contract done that Council can ratify for that 3-year period. If there are issues along the way, I would hope that Council can trust staff to either work those out, and if we do have to proceed to the second vendor, we would update council as to the progress of that. So I don't anticipate any issues with that. However, if we do run into a problem, then staff would begin negotiating with the second vendor that's ranked accordingly.
Would we be advised of that change and the reasons for why you were moving to number 2?
Mayor, council, absolutely.
I'd make a motion, but there may be other people that have questions or comments.
No.
I'll make a motion.
All right. As much as I like Eureka and appreciate the excellent work that they've done in cooperation with the city for a long time, I think that the right thing to do, because of the cost analysis, is to give tennis a shot at this. And so I'm going to make a motion to direct staff to proceed with recycling contract negotiations in ranking order as follows: 1, tennis sanitation; 2, Eureka Recycling; and 3, Veolia Environmental Services.
Second.
Okay, so Mr. Nephew has made a motion, and it was seconded by Mr. Copen. And in his motion, he's asking that we start with tennis, move to Eureka, and then to Veolia. And in the discussion part, I am concerned a little bit about some of the educational aspects of things, and so I'm trying to figure out how we can, in that negotiation process, assure that we're going to get an adequate amount of education, basically. And so
I'd say we should make it clear to staff that that's something we expect to be integrated into the process, and if we can't get what is required, that would be, I think, one of the reasons to move on to the next vendor on the list.
any other discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Nay.
Okay, passes 4-1. Councilmember Juniman dissenting. Thank you all for your time. The next item on our agenda is a resolution of support for the submittal of Environmental Protection Agency Brownfield Cleanup Grant for the Gladstone Savannah Restoration Project.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The city is requesting a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency Brownfield Cleanup Fund in the amount of $200,000 in order to help fund the cleanup of contaminated soil at Gladstone Savannah. The Gladstone Savannah is located at the core of the Gladstone neighborhood and previously supported a railroad repair and maintenance facility that operated from the late 1940s until the 1980s. So environmental investigations of the site do show contaminated soil to be present at concentrations above regulatory criteria. The soil cleanup activities are necessary in order to safely restore the site for future use and to obtain regulatory approval from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Program. Grant funds are awarded early in 2011. They must be used within 3 years and require a 20% match by the city. The funding timeline would fall in line with the city's capital improvement program for the Savannah, which shows the cleanup and restoration of the Savannah taking place during the Phase 2 improvements of the Gladstone neighborhood redevelopment in 2011. As part of the grant process, the Environmental Protection Agency requires that a resolution be adopted by the City Council in support of the grant application, and that's before you tonight. In addition, another requirement is a community notice of the city's intent to apply. City staff did publish a notice in the Maplewood Review announcing the City Council review of the grant application tonight. So the grant process further requires the City Council to allow an opportunity for the public to review the cleanup proposal during the meeting and consider public comment. So tonight, We are recommending that, number one, you allow an opportunity for public comment on the grant application